Chapter 1. Fight. "We're organized, and we're taking over," Ed Roberts shouted at Dr. Henry Breen. A dozen long-haired University of California, Berkeley students in electric wheelchairs stuffed into one hospital room nodded in angry agreement. Two members of their group had been kicked out of campus housing for questionable reasons. Ed and his friends were pissed off, and they were ready to fight. Roberts was the elder statesman of the zealous bunch. Entering the university in 1962 as an undergraduate, he was the first disabled student living on campus, housed in Cal Hospital, the campus infirmary. By October 1969, he was a doctoral student in political science, serving as the knowledgeable leader of this would-be band of radicals. In 7 years, he had developed numerous influential contacts on campus and in the community. He knew where the strings were located and was pretty good at pulling them. Breen was the medical director who oversaw the growth of the third floor of Cal into a small dormitory for students with physical disabilities. Nothing in Breen's medical training or extensive experience working with polio patients prepared him for mutiny. No one really expected the patients to rise up and take over the hospital. Deep inside, Breen must have smiled. He was the caring physician who took a chance on Ed when university administrators were not convinced that a neck-to-toe paralyzed man could attend college. A year later, he arranged for the formidable John Hessler, the sharp collaborator who became Ed's buddy, to join him in Cal. Although Breen disagreed with the California Department of Rehabilitation's decision to expel the two students, the physician withheld his formal approval of the students' protest. While he likely felt proud of his rabble-rousing charges, he was worried that an insurrection might jeopardize the Cal program he had carefully built. Breen and Ed Roberts both knew that the real target of the students' ire was State Rehab, the public agency that funded and oversaw the Cal program. A year earlier, buoyed by a sudden influx of federal grant dollars, State Rehab had more than doubled the number of disabled students in the campus residence. In fall quarter 1969, the psychedelic echoes of Jefferson Airplane and the pungent scent of marijuana filled the tile hallways of the medical ward. The disabled students and their youthful personal attendants easily smuggled alcohol past the frustrated nurse-minders. The third floor of Cal Hospital was a party scene, rivaling the most raucous fraternity. Worried state rehab bureaucrats assigned Lucille Withington, a hard-nosed, no-nonsense counselor, to clean up what appeared to be a rowdy mess. She instituted new academic requirements above the university standards. She scrutinized the students' grades and class attendance. She increased the number of courses they had to take per academic quarter. The Cal residents saw Withington as a harsh and demeaning taskmaster. In their eyes, she was the embodiment of medical social control, tying them down at a time when they were busting loose, creating lives of independence and self-mastery. Many had wasted their adolescent years in hospitals. This was their lucky break, their big chance to be free, to be Berkeley students at the height of the hippie revolution. Then Withington dropped the hammer. On Tuesday, September 16, 1969, she kicked undergraduates Don Lawrence and Larry Biscamp out of Cal. She claimed they were not making sufficient academic progress. On a campus where edgy nonconformity was the norm, Ed and his friends believed Withington was making an example of the two most loudly divergent students. "She picked these two most active spokesmen for our group," Ed told the San Francisco Chronicle. He depicted the two as average young people in Berkeley, persecuted for their bohemian lifestyle. "We refused to cut our hair for her or use underarm deodorants. Sometimes our rooms were a little messy. We were very normal Cal students, and that upset her greatly." Lawrence was a gay man whose sexuality and mind-blowing wardrobe were viewed as disruptive by hospital and rehabilitation staff members. His free-flowing approach to academic study was more zen than strategic careerism. Biscamp was a constant critical thorn in Withington's side. He loudly agitated among the disabled students, calling them to act in defiant solidarity against the pushy counselor. Both ejected students were beloved members of the crew, but Lawrence's expulsion struck a particularly sour note among the personal attendants who provided personal care to the physically disabled students. Numerous personal attendants were gay. The largely concealed alternative lifestyle enclave of Third Floor Cow was a tolerant space for gays and lesbians. The students and their attendants tended to view homosexuality and disability as analogous, two groups widely misunderstood and scorned. Ed quickly rallied the disabled students to fight back. Dinnertime rap sessions became late-night political strategy meetings. Tipping their hats to the rebellious image of the Rolling Stones, the group named themselves the Rolling Quads. Ed was their leader. They were proud, united, and mad. Eleanor Smith, the ward nurse who assisted the students with hygiene and medical needs, found herself caught in the crossfire. A non-disabled man named Mike Fuss worked as her assistant. The two argued bitterly. Fuss was a white man who had been active in the African American civil rights movement. When the Van de Kamp restaurants of the San Fernando Valley refused to hire black workers, Fuss organized demonstrations. He was one of many Berkeley New Left activists who trained originally in the ideology and nonviolent protest tactics of the civil rights movement. With his keen political eye, Fuss viewed the Rolling Quads as a rising class of political advocates seeking the right to control their own lives. Smith wanted them to be compliant patients and good students. Upset by the students' radicalization, the nurse abruptly resigned. Ed plotted strategy. Returning Lawrence and Biscamp to Cal was the immediate goal, but he also had a longer game in mind. If they could win the fight to save their two friends, the victory could jumpstart a larger movement. They would replace the common idea of a disabled person as incapable and requiring supervision with the emancipatory notion that disabled people were valued, competent citizens who could direct their own affairs. In common thinking, disability had nothing to do with politics. Even in 1969 Berkeley, which was at the heart of the radical New Left and youth counterculture, few observers of the conflict between the disabled student and state rehab imagined that disability could be seen as a civil rights issue. The student residents of Third Floor Cow were young people whose bodies had simply failed them. Many were paralyzed by the polio virus outbreaks of the 1940s. Others had severe spinal injuries from car crashes and diving accidents. What they needed was good medical care and effective rehabilitation, not some half-baked protest movement. What they needed to do, in traditional terms, was politely take their medicine and follow doctor's orders. In Ed's outrageous imagination, this time, the so-called cripples didn't accept their fate with a sweet smile that comforted the dominant non-disabled community. The days of being grateful for charity crumb attitudes were over. He envisioned people with a variety of disabilities coming together to demand access to the American dream. While Ed's head was undoubtedly in the clouds, his actions were grounded in the realities of his own life. He had learned the practical lessons of gritty street fighting from his mother, Zona. Whenever an authority figure calmly pushed her son aside, the small but formidable woman fought back. She was an unlikely combatant, a mild, almost conciliatory person who felt deeply uncomfortable with conflict and confrontation. But she couldn't stand seeing otherwise respectable officials mistreat her son. She took on the school district leaders who refused to allow her son to graduate from high school. She battled the state rehabilitation system that declared Ed a person without useful potential. She clashed forcefully with university administrators who simply didn't care. Zona taught Ed that living well with a disability required fighting the people that held you down. Teamed up with his Rolling Quads pals for the first time, Ed wasn't dueling for his own life and future. He was part of an alliance of disabled people united for a shared cause. The real enemy wasn't their sick or weak bodies, but the stigmatizing attitudes and societal barriers that kept them out of the game. The political science student had figured out that nothing was more political than disability. The Rolling Quads met with Rod Carter, Lucille Withington's supervisor. They issued two simple demands: reinstate Biscamp and Lawrence immediately, replace Withington with a more amenable counselor who would give the disabled students greater control over their campus housing. The state rehab strategy was to divide the disabled students. They declared that disability wasn't a unifying characteristic like race or gender. It was an individual affliction to be treated with professional interventions targeted to a patient-specific condition. Carter and Withington said they only had a problem with the two rule breakers. Their disciplinary actions didn't involve the rest of the students. Just let the professionals do their work and go about your business. The students remained united. They flooded Carter with letters that clearly communicated that they stood in solidarity with their friends Lawrence and Biscamp. Negotiations with Rod Carter hit a dead end. He backed Withington, and she was not going to budge. The Rolling Quads did what outraged Cal students in 1969 did. They scheduled a public protest action. This is where Ed's skills shined. He believed that if they took their case to the press and the politicians, they would win in the court of public opinion. Ed phoned reporters at newspapers in Berkeley and San Francisco, inviting them to the demonstration. He called state senators and assembly members, including mental health advocate Nick Petras. He lobbied them to put pressure on the Department of Rehabilitation. He arranged for journalists to interview him inside his iron lung, the enormous steel contraption that pumped air into his lungs. Nothing moved the pity-filled uninitiated like sitting down next to the wheezy machine with Ed's grinning face poking out one end. What others viewed as a scary steel tomb was Ed's secret weapon. The American Disability Rights Movement, a multi-decade national campaign advocating for the civil rights of people with disabilities, began with a small campus protest in Sproul Plaza. Ed and John Hessler strategically set their demonstration in the sacred temple of Berkeley activism, where the free speech movement began. From Vietnam War protests to the Third World Liberation Front and the ugly battle over People's Park, the Sproul Hall steps was the place. Sproul Plaza was a counterculture circus, a daily celebration of individuality and freedom of expression. Disabled student Bob Metz once described the Sproul Symphony as two guitarists and a fiddler playing the Grateful Dead's Ripple, combined with a pair of violin-playing women in bathing suits and straw hats performing classical music, all surrounded by a chanting orange troupe of Hare Krishnas burning incense and ringing bells. It was a phantasmagoric public theater of youthful creativity. The disabled students had a special fondness for Sproul Hall. It was the first accessible campus building. 5 years earlier, Ed and Dean of Students Arlie Williams convinced the administration to install a wheelchair ramp at the side of the building. It was an important beginning. By Berkeley standards, the Rolling Quads held a very humble demonstration. 11 students in electric wheelchairs and an equal number of non-disabled supporters traveled from Cal Hospital to the base of the steps at Sproul Hall. Many wore fatigue army jackets, the unofficial uniform of Vietnam-era protests. Carrying signs and chanting slogans, they circled Ludwig's fountain at the plaza center. Many students glanced over, but just passed by. A curious few wandered in, drawn by the eye-catching gathering of wheelchairs, summoned by the sound of Ed and John Hessler speaking into a megaphone. The angry rhetoric of young people berating callous and unjust authorities was familiar stuff. The stories and issues were new. The two Rolling Quads leaders narrated the daily lives of physically disabled students. With great patience, they detailed the kinds of accommodations they needed to attend lectures, to study, and to keep up with assignments. As essential as these arrangements were, they certainly didn't define these Cal students. The speakers touted the group's oft-overlooked talents, intellectual ability, and strong desire to earn a degree. They were not charity cases. They were college students, like any other. But the Department of Rehabilitation was letting them down. They had promised to supply the necessary support and funding so that the students could succeed. But then they pulled a cruel trick. The cold state bureaucracy yanked the rug out and walked away. Hessler explained, "The accommodations will make the opportunity a reality. Without the accommodations, there is no reality or opportunity that can be fulfilled." Ed smartly persuaded the reporters to back the rolling quads. The San Francisco Chronicle and the Berkeley Daily Gazette portrayed the disabled students as victims of an unreasonable counselor and an unresponsive state agency. The decision to cut off funding to Lawrence and Biscamp amounted to inhumane treatment of disadvantaged people doing their best to make it in a challenging world. A state rehab spokesperson hung Withington out to dry, stating inaccurately that she exceeded her authority in telling them they had to leave Cal Hospital. Ed, the savvy graduate student who spent much of his teen years watching black and white television via a mirror hung above his supine head, knew the power of the media. His strategy foreshadowed, for example, the tactics of sophisticated gay rights groups decades later. In the mid-'80s, angered by the lack of television and newspaper coverage of the AIDS epidemic, gay rights activists systematically sought relationships with television and print journalists. Depictions of gay persons shifted from illness and depravity to normality and humanity. Interpersonal connections with reporters would change media depictions of otherwise devalued persons. While Ed enjoyed a rousing public protest, it was primarily his work winning over local newspapers that turned the tide. Supervisor Rod Carter quickly reinstated the two students and reassigned Withington to other duties. Ed later observed, "We knew that when you shine the light of publicity on a state agency, they can't take it." Carter replaced Withington with Gerald Belchek, an experienced counselor who bent over backwards to give the students control of the program. He later said, "Essentially, they, the students, got carte blanche. There wasn't anything they asked for they didn't get." Ed and his rolling quads not only won the first fight of the disability rights movement. In the tempestuous political climate of Berkeley, California, they invented a new kind of American politics. Disability was no longer just a matter of physicians and hospitals treating sick persons. It wasn't simply a matter of rehabilitation and hopeful recovery. It was a civil rights issue, a struggle by rejected and pitied people to gain access to the opportunities of mainstream society, to gain value in the hearts of fellow citizens. The very people who many viewed as weak, incompetent, and dependent would lead the way. Working with people with many kinds of bodily impairments from Berkeley, across the United States, and around the world, Ed Roberts crafted his life within and through this new movement. On the long activist road from Cal Hospital in September 1969 to signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act by President George H.W. Bush in July 1990, the man in the iron lung became an unlikely hero, an extravagant self-promoter, an exorbitant risk-taker, an unyielding fighter who made his mother proud. He didn't just lead the national and international disability rights movement. He very consciously and forcefully created an affirmative new way of being a disabled person. As Ed Roberts elevated himself and his people, he became the most recognized and celebrated disabled person on the planet.